Welcome to this YSL tutorial. In this video we're going to cover error handling in Excel VBA, and in the video we're going to talk about how you deal with runtime errors. We'll start with a quick explanation of what a runtime error is and how it differs from a couple of other types of errors in VBA. We'll then introduce you to the on error statement and show you as a first simple example how you can simply ignore runtime errors when they occur. As a more practical example, we'll then teach you how you can create your own custom error handler to do something a bit more useful than just ignore your errors, and at the same time we'll show you how you can resume running your code after an error has occurred. Towards the end of the video, we'll teach you how you can test for a specific type of error that's occurred using a special object, and finally we'll teach you how you can even raise your own custom runtime errors using the same object. So let's get started. A runtime error in VBA is literally an error which occurs while your program is running. It's important to distinguish runtime errors from two other kinds of errors in VBA. One's called a syntax error, and that's a mistake in the punctuation or the grammar of your sentence. So for instance, if I missed out one of the double quotes here when I'm referencing my worksheet, as soon as I move the cursor to another line, the VB editor indicates there's a syntax error by highlighting the whole thing in red. And I can't even attempt to run my subroutine until I've solved that problem, so let's put the double quotes back in. The next type of error is called a compile error, and compiling occurs whenever you choose to run a subroutine. Essentially, the VB editor goes through and checks that all the keywords you've used make sense in the context you've used them. So for example, if I'd used, instead of the word worksheets here, if I'd used the word worksheet instead. Now the word worksheet does exist in VBA, it's just that I can't use it in this context to select a worksheet. So if I did try to run my subroutine now, it would fail with a compile error. It's actually possible to compile a project without trying to run any subroutines though. If I head to the debug menu, there's an option there called compile VBA project, and as soon as I do that, the VB editor highlights the offending word in blue and shows me a compile error message. If I click OK and then spell this correctly again as worksheets, compile the project again, now everything's fine. Even when you've solved all of your syntax and compile errors, you might still find that your subroutines fail when you try to run them, because you might have written an instruction that can't be performed. And here's an example of one of those. I've tried to select worksheet 42, and I don't have that worksheet in my workbook. So when I try to run my subroutine either by running it from start to finish or pressing the F8 key to step through, I'll find that when I reach this instruction and I try to execute it, that's when my program will fail. And I'll get a runtime error dialog box. So you'll always be able to spot when you've encountered a runtime error, because that's exactly what the message will say. Each runtime error has a specific number, so in this case it's the number 9, a specific description, in this case subscript out of range, and often the choice to either continue, end, or debug. So if I click the end button here, that will stop running my subroutine. If I click debug, it will break into my subroutine and show me the line which has caused the runtime error in the first place. So there's a really good clue as to where your error is occurring. So this video is all about how you can write code to prevent your users from seeing the runtime error dialog box. I'm going to show you several techniques, and we're going to start by showing you the on error statement. Perhaps the simplest thing you can do in terms of error handling is tell your subroutine that if any runtime errors occur, ignore them and carry on with the next line of code instead. And to do that, you need to use the on error statement. Now you need to write your on error statement above any lines which can cause a runtime error, because it has to be activated before you've executed any instructions. So we're going to write the on error statement above the line which tries to select sheet 42, and we're going to tell this on error statement to resume next. So after that line of code in my subroutine, if any runtime errors occur, the editor will ignore them and resume running your program at the next line. So if I use the F8 key to step through now, we'll find that once this statement has been executed, that activates our custom error handler, and any lines which could generate a runtime error now are completely ignored in favour of the next line of code. That might sound like a great idea, being able to suppress the runtime error dialog box so your users will never ever see it. But it can potentially lead to some awful problems. What if we'd written a subroutine where everything below this line was contingent on us having successfully selected sheet 42, so every other line of code assumed that we were in sheet 42. If we just told our program to ignore the fact that when you select sheet 42 we can't do it, then all of the rest of the subroutine will essentially do invalid instructions. We'll be doing things we don't intend to do. So there are fairly few legitimate reasons for saying resume next. But here's one good example actually. Maybe if we were trying to, rather than select a worksheet, maybe if we were trying to delete a worksheet instead. So if I change the word select to the word delete. Now I'm actually going to go and insert sheet 42 into my Excel workbook. So I'm going to head back to the Excel workbook itself. I'm going to insert a new sheet. I'm going to call it sheet 42. I'm going to try to do that eventually. There we go, sheet 42. Then if I switch back to the VB editor, if I run this subroutine when sheet 42 exists, this will work normally. So I'll try to delete sheet 42, and I can choose to do so. Now it's gone. Now of course if I tried to delete the sheet and it didn't already exist, then normally that would throw a runtime error. But because of my onErrorResume next statement, when I try to do this, although it will technically fail, we don't see the error message. So essentially, if I try to delete sheet 42 and the sheet does not already exist, then I didn't need to delete it in the first place. So I can legitimately ignore this instruction and carry on with the rest of the subroutine instead. But as I say, there are fairly few reasons why you would want to always just ignore a line which has caused an error. To do something more sophisticated, we need a slightly different form of the onError statement. Let's go back to the idea of trying to select our non-existent worksheet, sheet 42. And at the moment, of course, our error handler will simply ignore the fact that I can't select that sheet. But what I would really like my error handler to do is detect that if I can't select that sheet, it most likely means that it doesn't exist, so go away and create it for me. So to make that work, what I would have to do is write a separate error handler within the same subroutine. So I'm going to write that down at the bottom of the sub. So traditionally you find your error handlers appear as the last part of your subroutine immediately before end sub. And I'm going to call my error handler create sheet 42. Sounds like a sensible name for it. And to turn this into what I want to turn this into a text label. I need to type in a colon after its name, and when I hit enter, if you've done it correctly, you'll find that it gets outdented to the left-hand edge of the code page. So what I can do in this little section here is I can tell the subroutine to create a new worksheet and call it sheet 42. So I can do that using the worksheets.add method. And the add method actually returns a reference to the sheet that's being created. So I can also tag onto the end of the add method .name equals sheet 42. So it's just a nice succinct way of creating and naming a worksheet at the same time. The problem that I've got now is I've got to tell my error handler that if a runtime error occurs, don't just carry on with the next line of code, because remember I might have hundreds of lines of code below this one. I want to tell it to explicitly go to this label. And I can do that. Instead of saying resume next, I can use the GoTo keyword and say GoTo create, I should have used a capital letter, sorry, create sheet 42. So, that error handler now, if I use the F8 key to start stepping through, I turn on my custom error handler and I'll try to select sheet 42. It doesn't currently exist. So we'll find that what will happen is, because of my error statement being in effect, it will jump down to this section of code and it will create the sheet for me and also name it as sheet 42. But then the subroutine ends, which isn't particularly useful. If I had lots of other lines of code to run after successfully selecting sheet 42, then I'd need to tell my error handler to go back to that part of the code. So let's imagine, for instance, that once I'd selected sheet 42, I would want to, I don't know, put today's date and time in cell A1, for instance, just as something very quick and simple. So I'm going to say range A1.value equals now. So that puts the date and time in there. So what I would need to do in my error handler is I would need to say, once I've created sheet 42, if it needed to be created, go back and run the line after the one that caused the error in the first place. So to do that, we've actually already seen the statement which does that. Resume next. So resume next will go back to the line after the one which caused the runtime error, and then carry on running my subroutine from that point. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to Excel, just to set this back up again. So I'm going to delete sheet 42, and I can successfully do that. Then back to the VB editor. I'm going to step through this subroutine again now. So I'm going to use F8 to start stepping through. This turns on my custom error handler, and then I try to select sheet 42, and that will fail. So I'm going to jump down to this line, as you'll see when I press F8, and I'll create and rename my new worksheet as sheet 42, and then resume next will go back to the line after the one which caused the error in the first place. So that will go back to range A1.value equals now, and there it is. Okay, you might be able to spot an obvious problem that's going to occur next. When I execute this line, the subroutine continues to run past my little label. These labels aren't sort of breakpoints. They don't prevent your code from running naturally all the way through. They're just points to which you can jump using the GoTo statement. So I'm going to stop running my subroutine at this point, otherwise I'm going to run into another error, and I'm going to try to create another worksheet called sheet 42, and that will fail. So I'm going to hit the reset button. With your error handlers, you only want the error handlers to run if you've legitimately got to that section using a GoTo statement. So what you traditionally have is an exit sub immediately before the error handling section. You often find people write these lovely sort of elaborate looking comments that clearly sort of delimit the error handling sections from the rest of the normal code. So silly little things like this. It's completely unnecessary, but it's just a nice way to sort of distinguish one part of your code from the rest. So let me just run this through one more time so we can see that it works properly now. I'm going to go back to Excel, and I'm going to delete sheet 42, and then back to the VB editor, and I'll step through using the F8 key. So I turn on my custom error handler. I try to select sheet 42, which fails. So I jump to the error handler. I create and name my new worksheet as sheet 42, and then go back to the line after the one which caused the error, which I successfully run, and then end the subroutine before I get a chance to run the error handling code again. Perfect. One thing to realize about custom error handlers is that once they've been activated, they remain active until either the end of the subroutine or until you switch them back off. So in this particular example, once this line of code has been executed, any runtime errors which occur at all will be handled by Excel trying to create a new worksheet and calling it sheet 42. So let's see if we can demonstrate why that might be a problem. I'm going to write another line of code into my subroutine which will deliberately cause a runtime error. I'm going to try to set the value of range A2 equal to an expression that will cause a runtime error, and it's the expression 1 divided by 0. And hopefully, as you all know, you can't divide by 0 in Excel. That generates the divide by 0 error. So if I start to step through the routine, bearing in mind that sheet 42 already exists in this particular example, then my error handler gets turned on, worksheet 42 gets selected because it already exists, I set the value of range A1 to the value of the date and time, and finally I try to execute this line of code. Now this will cause a runtime error normally, which means, because of the error handler that I've turned on, I jump to this section of code and I try to create a new worksheet and call that sheet 42. And in this particular example, that in itself would cause a problem because sheet 42 already exists, and you can't have two sheets with the same name. So I'm going to abandon running the subroutine at this point and show you how you can switch off your custom error handlers after they've been switched on. To do this, we need a simple line of code which comes in after the line which could potentially cause a runtime error. So let me put a couple of blank lines in there. I'm going to write the statement on error, which we've already seen, go to, and then the digit 0, which is a little bit arcane. All you really need to understand about that line is that that is a line which deactivates any custom error handler. So it resets the system back to normal error handling status, which means that we just see the standard runtime error dialog boxes. So if I use the F8 key to step through again, of course this line works. Now my error handler gets switched back off again when this line executes. So any runtime error that occurs after this point will be handled in the normal way by displaying the runtime error dialog box. So that's how you can turn off a custom error handler once it's handled the error that you were expecting. We've seen the resume next statement used a couple of times to continue running a subroutine after the line which originally caused the runtime error. But you can also use the resume keyword to continue running a subroutine at any line of code. And we're going to demonstrate that with a slightly more complex example. So this subroutine allows a user to find a film from our list of favourite movies. If I just quickly show you the data, we're going to search for a film in this list and return some information about its running time. Its release date. So in the VBA editor, we've got a fairly simple subroutine which does that. We have a couple of variables, one for storing the film's name, one for storing the film's date. Then we use an input box to prompt the user to type in a film name. We go to sheet 1, and this is the line which is going to potentially cause us the problem. We try to select a cell in which the film name a user has typed in has been found using the find method. Then we pick up the film name and film date from the relevant cells, and then display a message showing the user some information about that film. So if I step through once just to show you what happens when it works properly, if I can type in a film name, I'll search for Spider and click OK. So I go to sheet 1, this successfully finds the name Spider in the list of cells B3 to B15, and it will select a cell. It retrieves the value of the active cell, which feeds in the full film title, then picks up the film's release date, and finally displays a message showing us what release date that film had. So when everything works properly, everything's fine. However, if I run this subroutine again, I'm going to hit F5 to run it this time, and type in a nonsense film name, or even a film which doesn't currently exist in the list. If I click OK, then we generate a runtime error. If you hit debug, that will again highlight the line which has caused the problem. And of course the reason is that the film I've searched for could not be found, so therefore I couldn't select the cell because there is no cell to select. So what I would really like to do here, rather than writing an error handler which tells the user that a film has not been found and then just ending, I'd like to tell the user that the film has not been found and then return them to the point of the subroutine where they're asked to type in a film name again. So let's start by writing the basic error handling statements. Above the line which can cause the error, we're going to say on error, and we're going to use a GoTo statement, and let's make up a label. I'm going to call it film not found. Then I can copy that label, head down to the bottom of the subroutine, and create it by pasting it in, typing in a colon after its name, and then let's display a message which says film name ampersand was not found. So there's a fairly basic error handling statement. We also want to make sure that we exit the sub before we reach our error handler, as we've learned. And we should also, as we've just learned, turn off our custom error handler immediately after we've handled the line which can cause the error to occur. So on error go to 0. So far, this is fairly straightforward. If I run the subroutine now, using F5, and type in some nonsense text, then my subroutine will tell me that that film could not be found, and then it simply ends. What I'd really like to do is return to the point of the code which I'm asked for a film name. So to do that, we're going to use another label. What should we call this one? Let's say guess again, something simple like that, and then type in a colon immediately after it. So that sends it into a label. Then, in the error handler itself, we can say resume, and then simply use the name of the label we've created. Guess again. So, rather than the word next, you simply use the word or the name of a text label that you've created in your code. So if I run the subroutine again using F5, I can type in nonsense text, hit OK, I'm told that it wasn't found, hit OK, then I'm asked for another film name immediately. And I can carry on doing this as often as I like. Every single time I type in something wrong, then I'm asked for another film name, until I finally get it right. Let's type in another word, brave this time, and then I get some sensible information, and then the subroutine ends. So, it's a fairly unsophisticated technique, but you've seen that you can resume running your subroutine at another line of code using a label. What I guess would be the ideal solution to this particular system would be to ask the user if they wanted to guess again, rather than always deliberately taking them there. To do that, we can use our message box and provide a couple of buttons that the user can click on. So at the end of the message box statement, we can type in a comma and ask the message box to display VBA, retry, and cancel buttons. So Once we've got the message box to display that, we then need to be able to capture the user's input. Which button have they clicked? So to do that, we'll use another variable. So at the top of the subroutine, we'll declare a new variable. I'm going to call it button clicked as a VB message box result. You may have seen this done in our previous video on using message boxes. Then back down to the message box line again, and I want to say button clicked equals my message box. And because I'm now capturing the results of the message box, I need to ensure that its parameter list, its argument list, is enclosed in a set of round brackets or parentheses. So there we go. What we can do then, once we've successfully captured the button that's been clicked, is we can test if the button clicked using an if statement. If button clicked equals VB retry, then I want to resume at the guess again label. I'm going to write this as a single line if statement, because if I didn't click VB retry, if I click the cancel button instead, then the subroutine will just end automatically. So there's the entire subroutine written. Let's step through this one this time, and I'm going to step through it first of all, trying to generate an error. So if I type in nonsense and click OK or press enter, then this line works happily. My error handler gets activated. This line will fail, which means I jump down to the error handling section, and I display a message box telling me that that film was not found, but provides me the retry and cancel buttons. If I just click cancel, then my if statement fails, so the logical test is failed, and my subroutine just ends. Let's go through again quickly, get to the point where I can type in a piece of text, and then step through again. Now I'm back to my error handler. So this time I'm going to click the retry button, and this time my if statement, my logical test will pass, so then I resume at the guess again label, which means I'm asked for another film name. If I type in nonsense again and click OK, just one more time round, and then I'll click cancel this time, it fails, so the subroutine ends. I haven't actually run it to prove that it does actually work if I search for a film which does exist. So let's run it one more time. I'll type in Hobbit this time, hit enter, and it tells me some sensible information about that film. So there's a reasonably complete basic error handling system. So far, all of our examples have used just a single error handler. But what if, as is, let's face it, much more likely in the real world, you've got multiple sources of potential errors in your single subroutine? So for example, when we're picking up the film's date in this subroutine, what if the value of that cell was not actually a date? Our data type for our variable is only allowed to store a date. So if I switch back to Excel, and let's deliberately break this by putting in a piece of text instead of a date into Spider-Man's release date. If I go back to my VB editor and run the subroutine, then I'll search for Spider, hit OK, but this time the subroutine fails on a different line of code. So we'd almost need a different error handler altogether for this potential line. So here's how we're going to do this. If I stop running the subroutine, I'm going to turn on another error handler immediately before that line can be executed. I'm going to say on error, GoTo, I'm going to call this one invalid date. Then I'm going to copy that label, as previously, down to the bottom of my subroutine, paste it in, type in a colon after it, and then hit enter. I mustn't forget to turn off my error handler, so I'm going to go back and do that again now, on error GoTo 0, as we've seen the problems that can cause. And then, in the error handler itself, I'm going to write a message which says, what shall it say? It should say film name ampersand was found, but its date is in the wrong format, something like that. Something like that will do. And then I can run this subroutine again. So if I press F5 to run it, search for Spider, hit OK, and then I get a sensible message rather than my runtime error. Now, one thing to be careful of when you're doing things like this is if you have multiple error handlers, remember we still have an error handler which deals with the fact that if I can't find the film that I'm searching for, I get a sensible message. Now if I click cancel on this dialog box rather than retry, so I don't go back to the top of my subroutine, when I click cancel, I'm immediately presented with the next error message. So I'm going to click OK. And the reason for that, of course, is as we've seen earlier on, these labels don't separate out your code, they don't stop your code from running. So as soon as this message has appeared, if I haven't resumed at this label, then I just carry on running the rest of the subroutine anyway. So another exit sub just before we reach the next error handler is a sensible idea here. You can have as many exit points, as many exit subs within a single subroutine as you like, and you'd tend to find those happen at the end of each separate error handler. So with the whole system in place, if I run it one more time, I can search for nonsense and hit OK, and I'm presented with an error message saying I can retry, so I'll go again, and then I could search for, let's say I'm going to search for brave, and I get a sensible message. And that all ends. Run it one more time, search for nonsense, retry, search for spider, and click OK, and then I get a sensible message rather than my runtime error that I previously would have got. So, again, a slightly more complete system with two error handlers in the same routine. There's one, and there's the other. There are lots of different types of runtime errors that can occur, and sometimes it can be quite useful to test for exactly which one has occurred in your error handling statements. So in this very simple subroutine, we're trying to open up a specific workbook, and we're doing that in 3 steps. First of all, by changing the drive to E, changing the directory to the My Files folder on that drive, and finally opening up the workbook called Book1 that is in that folder. So there's 3 stages where this could fail. First of all, if I try to run it and I don't have access to drive E, I get the runtime error number 68. So I'm going to end the subroutine there, and instead I'm going to plug in a quick removable disk, and then I can step through the routine again. So now that the disk exists, this line will work. But I might not have the folder called My Files on that drive, and if I press F8 there, then I get runtime error number 76. Finally, if I do fix that problem, if I quickly switch to Windows Explorer, head onto that folder and try to rename my folder as My Files. Then, if I step through again, when I successfully execute these 2 lines, I might find that the file I'm trying to open doesn't actually exist, and I get a standard runtime error 1004. So, 3 types of errors associated with the same action, essentially, with different error numbers and different descriptions. We're going to write an error handler which tests for exactly which error number has been generated. So let's start by writing the onError statement, and I'm going to do that at the top of the subroutine. I'm going to say onError, GoTo, problem. That's the name of my label this time. Then I'm going to copy that label and paste it in down at the bottom of the routine. Make sure I type in a colon after it, and that's my label created. I also want to make sure that I exit the subroutine before I reach that label, so I'm going to have an exit sub, and then we can begin testing which error has actually occurred. So we can do this with an if statement, or a case statement if you prefer. I'm going to use an if, and what I want to do is I want to test the number of the error that's been generated. So I can do that using a function called ERR, or as I prefer to pronounce it. ERR followed by a full stop provides you with a list of properties and methods of the runtime errors. So the property that I'm interested in here is the number of my error, and I want to check if that is equal to the number 68. If that's true, then I know that that's a problem to do with the drive not being accessible. So I can display a message to the user that says something like, drive E isn't available, have you plugged in the USB disk? Have you plugged it in? There we go, slightly patronising, but there we are. What I can do then on the next line is I can write an else if that would test for if the err.number is equal to number 76. And that was a problem, as we saw, that occurs when the path doesn't exist, so when the My Files folder isn't there. So I'm going to say message box, the My Files folder isn't on the drive. Finally, we could test explicitly, I suppose, for the 1004 error, again using err.number, but that's such a generic error that occurs under all sorts of circumstances that it's probably better here just to say else, and then a message box saying book 1 wasn't found. Are you sure it's there? Question mark, and then close the double quotes, and finally an end if. Okay, so there's our error handler. It tests the error number for each potential source of error in this little miniature system here. So, I've removed the USB disk to make sure it's not available, and if I begin stepping through now using the F8 key, I should find that when this line tries to execute, it fails, and it does. And in my error handler, I can see the number of the error that's been generated when I hit the F8 key. It turns out that this is number 68, and it tells me a sensible message saying that drive E isn't available and patronisingly asks me, have you plugged it in? Click OK, end if, and then the subroutine ends. So let's try plugging the USB disk back in again. There it goes. And I can use the F8 key again to begin stepping through, and this time that line works. Now the My Files folder does exist as it stands. What I'm going to quickly do is head back to the to Windows Explorer window and modify the name of that folder so that it's not called My Files. I'm going to make it called My File. Okay, so back to the VB editor again. Try that again. Back to the VB editor. If I try to execute this line now, that folder doesn't exist, so this line will fail. And this time it's not error number 68, this time the error number is 76. So I fall through to that part of the if statement and show a different message instead. End if, and then the subroutine ends again. So I'm going to head back to the Windows Explorer window again, and let's try to rename that folder so that it's called My Files. And let me just quickly check what file name I've got in there. It's called Book 11 at the moment. So back to the VB editor. Step through again using F8. This line should work, this line should work, this line will fail, so I fall through to the problem error handler, and this time I get a slightly more generic message saying that book 2 wasn't found. Book 1 wasn't found. So end sub. Finally, let's get to the point where we can actually run the whole thing from start to finish. Let's rename this as book 1 so we can find it. Back to the VB editor, step through using F8. Nothing fails this time, the whole system works. I've got book 1 open, exit sub, ends the subroutine. Book 1's actually blank, by the way. What a lot of effort for not very much, but hopefully you can see the point of using the Err object to test for the type of error number so you can make your errors that little bit more specific. To finish this video, we're going to show you how you can use the Err object to raise your own custom errors. And we're going to come back to where we came in, selecting a worksheet which doesn't exist. So obviously if I try to run this subroutine, I get a standard runtime error dialog telling me a basic number and a basic message. The Err object actually allows you to customize the runtime error dialog itself. So if I end the subroutine, what I'm going to do is write an on error statement, on error, go to custom error, and then copy that label, make sure I have an exit sub, paste the label in below, type in a colon after it, and then I can write my code in here to raise a custom error message. To do that, I need to refer to the Err object again, and then I need to apply the raise method to it. So there we go, that's the raise method, and there's several parameters for the raise method that we can specify. And the first one is non-optional, the first one is the number of the error. And as we've already seen, every single runtime error has its own unique error number, and you want to make sure that the numbers you apply are completely unique so that they don't conflict with any existing error number. And the standard way to do that, according to Microsoft, is to use a constant called VB Object error, so reference that first, and then simply add a number to that. So if I add the number 1, that guarantees that I generate a unique error number that doesn't conflict with any existing one. The next parameter is called source, and that's essentially a way for you to provide a piece of information about where the error itself came from. So I could say, for instance, the name of my subroutine here. I could say raising custom errors. There we go. Finally, the third parameter we'll look at, description. I won't bother with help file and context here. We're going to go for the description, and that's just a more descriptive string of text which explains what the error actually is. So I'm going to say worksheet 42 doesn't exist. So it's a fairly basic message. And as we've seen, we could have done this in a simpler way earlier on without raising our own custom error. But if I use the F8 key to step through the routine now, we'll switch on the custom error handler. When we try to select the sheet, which doesn't exist, we raise our own custom error, so you'll end up seeing a customized version of the runtime error dialog box. So there's your custom error number, completely meaningful obviously, and there's our custom message, which is a little bit more useful. In real world terms, you're unlikely to use the raise method for the Err object unless you're writing class modules more usually. You'll have to wait until we do the video on class modules to understand why that's the case. But yeah, in the real world you probably wouldn't tend to raise your own custom errors. You tend to use more simplistic error handling of the type we've already seen in the video. Okay, so there's the end of the video on error handling. Hope you found it useful. Thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this training video, you can find many more online training resources at www.wiseowl.co.uk.